Greetings hobbyists, this is Arsans of Vol, and in this video we're going to have a look at how we can connect pistons and cables to a rig for a mechanical arm. So in our last video we were setting up this rig, so we've got our inverse kinematics and we can move this around just by moving this one point, which is obviously very useful for posing. But we ended it to the point where we hadn't quite finished everything off. We'd got everything sorted, and if you want to have a look at that video there is a link in the description, but we hadn't finished looking at how to use this for things like pistons, which we've got some pistons set up here, and then for how to use this to pose a cable, and we've got a cable just there. So we're going to look at these one at a time, and the first thing we'll start with is how to pose these pistons, because at the moment, if I go into pose mode, this will move around, and those are going to stay, well, there. They're not going to be connected to anything. So I'm going to hide the cable to begin with, and we're going to start looking at this. Now the first thing I'm going to do in pose mode, just to make this easier to see, is I'm going to press Alt and H to unhide all of our bones, and then we're going to start having a look at what we need to do. So the first thing we need to do is we need to get each of these pistons to have its own bone. So to do that, we're going to click on our armature, go into edit mode, click off, and then we're going to want to bring in a new bone. Now if we do this, this is going to come in here. So if I press Shift and A, it's going to bring in a, well, hidden bone that's just there. So if I press G, I can move that around. If I click on the whole thing, I can move it all the way over here. But posing that's going to get a little bit annoying, and making sure it's exactly in the right place takes more time. So I'm going to delete that bone. What I'm going to do is in object mode, I'm going to bring my cursor to the correct point. Now, I've already sorted this out by bringing the origin to this bottom point. So I can Shift and S and bring my cursor to selected. And now, when I click on my armature, go into edit mode, and then Control and A, it's going to bring that bone in here. I'm going to just click on that and S to scale that up a bit. Now we also want this to be where the end of our piston is, to make sure that it's lined up. So I want this, this is for the rigging part, to be connected to the end of my bone. So what I'm going to do is click off, go into object mode, go into edit mode for this, and then I'm just going to select something like that ring, Control and S, bring the cursor there, click on my armature, go into edit mode, select the tip, Shift S, and then I want to move that to the cursor, just as we did with our bones for the main part of the rig. So I'm just going to do that now quickly to save some time, because we're just going to do that process repeatedly. So there we go. It's not too long a process, but it's just doing the same thing again and again, and I didn't think me explaining through that repeatedly would be particularly helpful. Now there is one thing that is important here, and that's to do with each of these bones. You'll notice that for each piston, what you need to do is make sure that the wider part of this octahedral bone, so effectively there, or for this one there, is on the pivot point. Then your bit that's sticking out at the end of the bone is going to be at the other central point. So these minor bits are pointing away from the pivot point. So for this bone, major point is on the pivot point, minor point is down the piston away from it. The other thing that we want to do is we want to name these bones just to make everything easier. Now, this is up to you how you do it. I don't know if there's a standard naming convention for it, but I'll call this piston and then give it a number like 1, and then I'll call this major because it's the thicker part of the piston. And then for the other one, it's going to be piston 1 minor. Just sorting that out for the other one. And finally, for the bit that repeats what we were doing with the other rig, we want to connect each of our piston parts to the relevant bone. So I'm going to come here and come into pose mode, click on the part, click on the piston that I want, and then Control and P, and I want bone. And then the same for each other part. So Control and P, bone. And do remember this is done in pose mode, so you can specifically select the bone of the armature that you want. You can't do this in edit mode where you'll select the whole armature. So now we've got those connected, and if I come into pose mode and then grab this, we can just move that around and, oh, nothing happens. Well, why does nothing happen? Well, at the moment nothing is happening because these bones are not actually connected to the armature in any way. So what we need to do is connect this to the relevant bone. And this is generally done, almost easily done in edit mode. So I'm going to click the bone, shift click the bone I want it to be parented to. So notice the minor bone, what we'd refer to as the child, gets then connected to the major bone, Control and P, and you'll notice it has a smaller menu, and we want to make a parent and keep the offset. And what that means now, again, if I go into pose mode and press G, this will now stay connected to that bone. Now for our one here, importantly, this is not going to be connected to this bone. It is being connected to the bone that it's part of the object that it's connected to. So this piston is actually connecting to this upper arm, so I need to parent it to that bone. Again, Control and P. The reason we do keep offset, we don't want connected. If I click connected, it will automatically move it to the point at the end of the bone as if I'd extruded it out. So we don't want that. So Control P and keep offset. And then we're going to do the same for the other bones. So now at this point, everything is working out, except for the pistons aren't moving and they swing around with the thing that they're connected to as if they're sort of solidly part of it. We can see that here. So now we need to keep them pointing to the other end of the piston. And this is actually relatively easy to do. All we need to do is click on our bone and we want to set up a bone constraint. So we're going to add a bone constraint. So that's selecting this blue icon here, and notice this is different to where you do the inverse kinematic relationships. It's a constraint, and then you want to come to add bone constraint and damped track. And what that does is it tells us, well, we need to target something. We need to target our armature, and then it says what bone do you want it target to. We know we want to target this on our piston 1 minor. And then for this one, we're going to do the same thing, add constraint, damp track. We want to connect it to the armature, and then we want to connect it to piston 1 major. So now they'll be pointing towards each other, and if I go into pose mode, and then let's move that to the side, G, our piston is going to move with it. So everything is sorted, okay? Now, you may need to check how your piston works. For example, I've made sure that my piston is just about long enough that it's going to go to the end of this point. In fact, actually, if I go into face mode, that might need to be a little bit further along. So let's undo that, and I want this to be a little bit longer. So I'm going to go into edge mode, Shift and Z, and then I'm going to G, G, and then C to keep it locked to that and make it just a little bit longer. There we go. And now that should still, if I come into here and pose mode, that should still work. There we go. And now it's going to work perfectly. So that's how we get that sorted. Then we want to do the same for these. So again, exactly the same thing. Add bone constraint, damp to track, want it connected to the armature, and this time the bone is going to be our piston 2 minor, and then same for this one, add bone constraint, damp to track, target is the armature, and then we want to change that to piston bone 2 major. And now in pose mode, we've got all that working. So now to pose our cable, we're going to use a similar technique, but we need to do something a little bit different, hence why it's the second part of the video. Now, the first thing to notice is that we have got this cable and it is just a curve, and that's quite important for this to work. Now, I will also point out that at the moment this curve is made up of 3 points, and that's going to be important for later where we're going to notice that there's a bit of a problem with this, so we'll come back to that. But for now, let's talk through the basics. So what we want to do is, in a similar way, attach this to our armature, but we don't have any bones, or we don't want bones to attach to this armature. We need to make something else. So what you do is you click on your end and then press Ctrl and H, and that gives you an option to create something called a hook. So I'm going to click hook to new object, and you'll see that we make an empty. If I come to my object outliner here, you can see this empty has just been made. And then we're going to do the same thing for this point as well. So Ctrl and H, hook to new object. And now we've got these hooks. We click on the hook and we've got a constraint option, add object constraint, child of, we want to target the armature and we want it to be bone, well this is bone 1, 2, 3. So we've got that there. Now for some reason this just then splurges off to some unknown place. I'm not sure why it does that actually. All we need to do is click set inverse and it fixes it. And then we're going to do the same with this one, add object, child of, click on the armature. We want this to be bone 4 this time, because I've just named them 1, 2, 3, and 4. Again, disappears off to some random place, set inverse, and we've got this all sorted. Now, this isn't going to quite work, and you'll see why, and hopefully you'll be able to guess why in a second. So, in pose mode, I'm going to grab my inverse kinematic, press G, and you'll see this sort of works, but it's getting stuck on something. And the thing it's getting stuck on, yes, you've probably guessed it, is this point here. Now, we've got some options. You could either make another hook for this and attach it to one of the bones, probably this bone here, or we could just control an X to get rid of that. And what I might want to do is fiddle around with, let's say, this one and potentially scale this in a little bit. So something like there. And then this should now work. So pose mode, select all of these bones except for the IK one, and then H to hide them. And we can start moving this around. We can see this working nicely with our pistons, but we do have a slight issue. The major issue that we've got is that, well, this doesn't work that nicely. Also, do notice if you move this around really quickly, have a look at the piston over here, you'll notice this doesn't like it. So if I press G really quick, the piston sort of sticks out. Don't worry, this will be something if you just undo it and then just move it around more slowly, it will work fine. It's just where it gets really quick, it can get confused with things. If you're animating, just so you know, this will do this, or when you do this with keyframes, this is not going to cause you any problems. So just be aware of that. No issues if you do this with keyframes. Just don't mess it around really quickly. The other thing that we'll notice that it happens is that when I do this, it stretches my cable. My cable doesn't keep a consistent length, and if I do something like that, it is going to fold in on itself, and that might not be something you want. I mean, you do need to think about where you put your cables. Here is not probably the best choice, or if it is, when I pose it, I'm then going to redo it. I'm going to be perfectly honest, I'm really lazy because I've got cable rater. I generally don't bother with this. I then generally pose this, and then just use cable rater to Control Alt C, create a cable, and then I'll just click there, and then S to scale it up. I do this after the fact because I'm lazy and it's quicker, and I can control the tension here more easily and do things like that. So that's my choice, but I'm not doing this for animation, I'm doing this for 3D printing. So that's entirely up to you. But yeah, I quite like cable rater for this. I actually find it less of a pain than having to deal with all of the posing and the hooking of these cables. Depends what you like and what you want. So there we go. We've got our posed pistons and cables. Have a great day, guys.